Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said his country will set its own tariffs on imports of billions of dollars of U.S. goods.
Canada's decision to cut off oil and power exports to the United States in response to newly elected President Donald Trump's aggressive tariff policies sent shockwaves across North America, reshaping the geopolitical and economic landscape overnight. The move, unprecedented in modern U.S.-Canada relations, was a direct reaction to Trump's announcement of sweeping tariffs targeting key Canadian industries, a measure that many in Canada viewed as an unfair and hostile economic attack. With both countries deeply intertwined in trade, energy, and industrial supply chains, the ramifications of this abrupt severance of resources were immediate and severe, affecting millions of lives on both sides of the border. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. For decades, Canada had been the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States, providing a stable and reliable energy source that fueled American industries, homes, and businesses. Additionally, vast amounts of hydroelectric power from Canada kept lights on in major U.S. cities, particularly in the northeastern states. The sudden halt of these critical resources threw the U.S. energy sector into disarray as refineries accustomed to processing Canadian heavy crude scrambled to find alternative sources, and electricity grids reliant on Canadian hydro faced immediate shortfalls. Prices soared overnight, with gasoline spiking at the pump, heating costs surging, and rolling blackouts becoming a looming threat in regions dependent on Canadian energy imports. The timing of the crisis compounded the severity of the situation. Trump's tariffs, aimed at boosting domestic industries by imposing heavy duties on Canadian steel, aluminum, and other essential goods, were met with immediate backlash from Ottawa. Canada's government, under pressure from both industry leaders and the public, saw little choice but to retaliate with the most potent leverage it had: energy. Unlike previous trade disputes, which often involved drawn-out negotiations, this confrontation escalated rapidly into an all-out economic standoff, with neither side willing to back down. The economic fallout within the United States was felt almost instantly. Major American corporations, many of which relied on Canadian raw materials and energy, faced production slowdowns and rising costs. Automakers, who depended on Canadian aluminum and steel for manufacturing, warned of impending layoffs and plant closures as material costs skyrocketed. The construction industry, another heavy consumer of these materials, braced for massive project delays and increased expenses, further straining the already fragile housing market. At the same time, smaller businesses and consumers bore the brunt of the crisis as energy costs surged, leading to higher prices for goods and services across the board. In Canada, the decision to cut off oil and power exports was not made lightly. Though it was an aggressive response to Trump's tariffs, it carried its own set of risks for the Canadian economy. The energy sector, particularly in Alberta, relied heavily on the U.S. market, and shutting down this trade meant job losses and potential economic instability at home. However, Canadian leaders framed the move as a necessary stand against economic bullying, emphasizing the need to defend national interests in the face of unfair trade policies. While some Canadian businesses suffered from the loss of their biggest customer, others saw new opportunities in diversifying trade, particularly by expanding exports to Asia and Europe. Public reaction in both countries was deeply polarized. In the United States, Trump's supporters largely defended the tariffs, arguing that Canada had long taken advantage of American markets and that a hardline stance was necessary to level the playing field. However, as the economic pain of the trade war became evident, many Americans, particularly those in energy-dependent industries, began to turn against the policy, questioning whether the president's aggressive approach was worth the cost. Protests erupted in cities across the country as workers faced job losses, and consumers struggled with higher costs, putting pressure on state governments to demand a resolution. In Canada, the mood was defiant. The decision to cut off energy exports was framed as a necessary act of self-preservation, a moment for Canada to assert its independence from an increasingly unpredictable neighbor. Political leaders rallied around the cause, calling for greater economic self-sufficiency and stronger partnerships with other trading nations. Even provinces that had traditionally been more accommodating toward the U.S., such as Ontario and British Columbia, found themselves aligned with the federal government in supporting the retaliation. The immediate diplomatic fallout was severe. Relations between Washington and Ottawa, already strained by Trump's rhetoric and previous trade disputes, deteriorated further. High-level negotiations between the two governments stalled as neither side appeared willing to offer concessions. Trump, known for his unpredictable approach to diplomacy, escalated his attacks on Canada through social media, accusing the country of economic sabotage and threatening further punitive measures. Canadian officials, in turn, warned that any additional aggression would only deepen the crisis. Energy markets across the world took notice of the escalating conflict. Oil prices saw dramatic fluctuations as traders reacted to the sudden disruption in North American supply chains. Countries that had long competed with Canada for the U.S. energy market, such as Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, saw an opportunity to increase their exports, though logistical constraints meant that immediate relief for American refineries was limited. Meanwhile, European and Asian nations expressed interest in increasing their imports of Canadian oil, a shift that could permanently alter global energy trade patterns. Beyond the economic consequences, the crisis also raised deeper questions about the future of U.S.-Canada relations. For decades, the two countries had enjoyed one of the most stable and cooperative relationships in the world, bound together by shared economic interests, cultural ties, and military alliances. The energy dispute, however, exposed deep vulnerabilities in that relationship, revealing just how quickly mutual dependence could turn into mutual antagonism. The trust that had underpinned trade agreements and diplomatic partnerships for generations was now in jeopardy, leaving both countries uncertain about the road ahead. As industries struggled to adapt and politicians dug in their heels, analysts warned that the longer the standoff continued, the greater the long-term damage would be. Energy experts cautioned that if the U.S. turned to alternative suppliers for oil and electricity, Canada might permanently lose its dominant position in the American energy market, a shift that could reshape the North American economy for years to come. At the same time, the United States faced the prospect of higher energy costs and industrial stagnation if it failed to secure a new reliable source of oil and power. Despite the mounting pressures, neither side appeared willing to make the first move toward reconciliation. Trump, determined to project strength and unwilling to be seen as backing down, doubled down on his tariff policies, insisting that they would ultimately benefit American workers. Canadian leaders, facing overwhelming public support for their retaliatory measures, remained steadfast in their refusal to restore energy exports until the tariffs were lifted. With neither country willing to compromise, the situation remained at a dangerous stalemate. The broader implications of the crisis extended far beyond North America. The abrupt energy cutoff and trade war between two of the world's largest economies sent shockwaves through global markets, raising concerns about supply chain disruptions, economic instability, and the potential for further escalation. International leaders urged both nations to de-escalate, warning that prolonged economic conflict between the U.S. and Canada could have ripple effects that would be felt worldwide. The situation also fueled debates over energy independence and the risks of over-reliance on a single trading partner. In the United States, the crisis prompted renewed calls for domestic energy production, with advocates pushing for increased drilling, fracking, and investment in renewable energy to reduce dependence on foreign imports. In Canada, the dispute reinforced the urgency of diversifying trade relationships, with policymakers accelerating efforts to secure new markets for Canadian oil and power. Meanwhile, everyday citizens on both sides of the border struggled with the tangible effects of the standoff. American consumers, faced with rising fuel and electricity prices, found themselves caught in the crossfire of a geopolitical battle that many had not anticipated. Canadian workers in the energy sector faced job insecurity as companies scrambled to adjust to the new reality. Businesses large and small were forced to navigate an uncertain economic landscape, with some finding ways to adapt while others faced financial ruin. The longer the crisis dragged on, the more entrenched both governments became in their positions. With no clear resolution in sight, tensions between the U.S. and Canada continued to escalate, raising fears that what had begun as a trade dispute could spiral into a broader economic or even political confrontation. The world watched closely, knowing that whatever happened next would have consequences far beyond North America's borders. The rupture between Canada and the United States over energy exports and tariffs continued to intensify, with each passing day bringing fresh challenges and deeper economic turmoil. As the crisis unfolded, the ripple effects extended far beyond oil and electricity, triggering a chain reaction that threatened multiple sectors and fundamentally altered the political landscape of both nations. The longer the standoff persisted, the more apparent it became that this was not just a temporary dispute, but a seismic shift in North American relations. One of the major industries to feel the weight of the energy cutoff was transportation. The United States, heavily reliant on Canadian crude oil for gasoline and diesel production, saw fuel prices skyrocket. Trucking companies, which formed the backbone of American commerce by moving goods across states and borders, faced immediate financial strain. Higher fuel costs translated into higher shipping rates, which in turn drove up the prices of everyday consumer goods. Supermarkets, unable to absorb these increased costs indefinitely, passed them on to consumers, leading to inflation in food prices. Families that had been struggling with the cost of living before the crisis now found themselves squeezed even further, with grocery bills surging alongside energy costs. The aviation industry was also severely impacted. Airlines, already burdened by fluctuating fuel prices, found themselves scrambling to adjust to the new reality. Many carriers were forced to raise ticket prices, reduce flight frequencies, and even cut routes entirely. Business and leisure travel took a hit, affecting hotels, restaurants, and tourism-dependent economies in cities across the United States. International travelers, wary of rising costs and uncertainty, began looking elsewhere, leading to a decline in U.S. tourism revenue. Canadian Airlines, while also affected by rising fuel prices, benefited from the surge in domestic demand as Canadians opted to vacation within their own country, rather than face the increased expenses of traveling to the U.S. The auto industry, already under pressure from the tariffs on steel and aluminum, faced an even harsher reality as manufacturing plants struggled to function without a stable supply of affordable energy. Factories that had operated on just-in-time production models suddenly found themselves unable to maintain efficiency. Some companies turned to alternative energy sources, but this shift came at a steep cost. The lack of affordable power meant that some manufacturing lines had to be shut down, leading to mass layoffs. Detroit, a city that had been trying to recover from economic downturns for years, found itself once again in crisis as thousands of workers faced unemployment. Meanwhile, American energy companies were scrambling to find ways to replace Canadian oil and power. Gulf Coast refineries, which had long depended on heavy Canadian crude, struggled to refine the lighter oil from domestic sources and other foreign suppliers. This mismatch created inefficiencies that further drove up costs. The U.S. government began reaching out to other oil-producing nations, but logistical hurdles and contractual obligations meant that replacing Canada's supply was neither immediate nor cost-effective. Strategic petroleum reserves were tapped, but even this was only a temporary measure. In response, the federal government urged domestic oil producers to ramp up production, leading to a renewed push for drilling in environmentally sensitive areas, sparking backlash from environmental groups and escalating domestic political tensions. Beyond the economic consequences, the energy dispute began reshaping the political landscape within both countries. In the United States, the backlash against Trump's tariffs and the subsequent energy crisis led to fractures within his own party. Republican lawmakers from energy-dependent states, particularly in the Midwest and Northeast, began breaking ranks, urging the administration to reconsider its approach. Governors in states hardest hit by the crisis, such as Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, demanded immediate relief, fearing the political consequences of inaction. Protests erupted across major cities, with labor unions, consumer advocacy groups, and industry leaders joining forces to pressure the administration into finding a resolution. In Canada, the government faced its own set of political challenges. While the decision to cut off oil and power exports was widely supported as a necessary response to Trump's economic aggression, there were internal debates over the long-term viability of such a strategy. The energy sector, particularly in Alberta and Saskatchewan, was experiencing economic turmoil, with thousands of workers uncertain about their future. At the same time, there was growing momentum to shift away from dependence on the U.S. market altogether. Some policymakers saw the crisis as an opportunity to accelerate efforts to strengthen trade relationships with Europe and Asia, particularly through expanded pipeline infrastructure leading to coastal export terminals. This idea gained traction, with the Canadian government fast-tracking new trade deals and infrastructure projects aimed at reducing reliance on the United States. Amid the escalating crisis, international allies and economic partners began weighing in. The European Union, long a proponent of free trade and economic stability, called for diplomatic intervention, fearing that prolonged conflict between Canada and the United States could disrupt global markets. China and India, two of the world's largest energy consumers, saw an opportunity in the turmoil, reaching out to Canada with proposals to increase imports of Canadian oil and liquefied natural gas. While Canada welcomed these overtures, logistical constraints meant that reorienting trade flows would take time. As weeks turned into months, the situation took on a more volatile character. The economic strain in the United States led to increased civil unrest, with demonstrations growing in size and intensity. Protesters targeted government buildings, corporate headquarters, and even energy infrastructure, demanding action from Washington. The stock market, already rattled by uncertainty, experienced significant fluctuations, with energy companies seeing their valuations plummet. Panic began to set in among investors as fears of a broader economic collapse loomed. At the same time, Canadian businesses that had once relied heavily on American markets were rapidly adapting to new economic realities. Some companies, particularly in the technology and renewable energy sectors, saw the crisis as an opportunity to innovate and diversify. The Canadian government poured resources into supporting domestic industries, launching initiatives to strengthen homegrown manufacturing, technology, and clean energy production. The country's pivot away from reliance on the United States was becoming more than just a short-term response. It was evolving into a long-term strategy. Despite the economic hardship, there were also unintended shifts taking place in consumer behavior. In the United States, the crisis forced a reevaluation of energy consumption patterns. Businesses and households began investing in energy efficiency measures, with a surge in demand for solar panels, battery storage systems, and electric vehicles. States that had previously been slow to adopt renewable energy policies now had a newfound urgency to reduce their dependence on external energy sources. In Canada, the economic strain led to greater investment in domestic industries, strengthening sectors that had previously been overshadowed by energy exports. As the standoff continued, cracks began to form in the U.S. government's position. With the economy faltering and public sentiment turning against the administration, political leaders on both sides of the aisle began searching for a diplomatic solution. Secret back-channel negotiations were initiated, with Canadian and American officials meeting behind closed doors to explore potential compromises. Pressure mounted from corporate leaders, trade associations, and foreign governments, all of whom recognized that the ongoing conflict was unsustainable. Yet, despite these efforts, Trump remained defiant. His rhetoric grew increasingly aggressive, with threats of additional economic retaliation against Canada. His administration floated the idea of imposing further tariffs on Canadian goods, even as economic advisors warned that such actions could deepen the crisis. Meanwhile, Canada, emboldened by international support and its success in finding alternative markets, refused to budge. The standoff had become not just a matter of economics, but a test of national resolve. The growing uncertainty took a toll on global confidence in North American stability. International markets, once heavily invested in the US-Canada trade relationship, began shifting their focus elsewhere. Foreign investors who had traditionally viewed the region as a safe and predictable economic zone started diversifying their portfolios, redirecting capital to other parts of the world. This shift had long-term consequences, altering the balance of global economic power in ways that would be felt for years to come. As the crisis reached its peak, the fundamental question became whether either side could afford to hold out indefinitely. With no immediate resolution in sight, the energy cutoff and tariff war had transformed into something far greater than a dispute over trade policy. It had become a defining moment in North American history. The outcome would determine not just the future of US-Canada relations, but also the trajectory of both nations' economies, political landscapes, and global standing. For the time being, neither side was willing to blink. The world watched as two of the closest allies in modern history stood locked in a bitter economic confrontation, with no clear path forward. What had begun as a policy decision had evolved into a full-scale economic war, the consequences of which would shape the future of the continent for generations to come. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Canada cutting off oil and power to the US? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.